you've led people in established organizations and startups. Are there any intrinsic differences in the people who are attracted to each type of organization such that change and dealing with ambiguity may be easier for some types of folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say in general, the average level of, let's call it the average level of uncertainty or ambiguity that an employee in a startup can deal with is in general higher than the average level of uncertainty that an employee of a large company may have, like everything else being the same, right?
Yeah.
But within the company, there is always this variance of people around that average in terms of people who can accept or tolerate a higher level of risk, higher level of ambiguity, higher level of creativity, higher ability to be comfortable and actually thrive on uncertainty, versus people whose first reaction is to resist change, ask questions on why not, and I think that spectrum of people who thrive on change or almost drive change versus people who are reluctant to change and are sort of put the brakes on change. I think that spread exists even in a startup, but it's all around that average, which is more uncertain, I think. And so even in a startup, I think we face the same degree of challenges because we're trying to move faster than in a larger company. So you got the same issues with velocity and constant, ability to change angles and change direction, because you got a bunch of passionate people who believe in passionate ideas. And so it's hard for them, for a founder to go to them and say, hey, we had assumptions A when we started, now it's an assumption B, right? Because the same guys who got attracted to an idea are now being told that there's a pivot and now there's a new idea, or there's a new market, or there's a new product that we got to build. So I think you have the same degree of, in some sense, the challenge of advocating change, primarily because change happens much faster in a startup, constantly in the journey. There is never a moment where what you've decided is your goal and what you're building as the product, who you're going as a customer, what's your go-to-market, is all fixed over the next 3 years. It just
Right.
doesn't. Like, I haven't seen a startup that does it. And maybe if there is one, hats off to them. But in most cases I have seen, you make an idea, you have a vision, you start with it, and then you're constantly changing and evolving every assumption you make. You're testing, you're failing, and you constantly need to take your team with it and push the team to actually think about new ways to get there. And that's not easy.
Well, isn't it true that established companies who fail to behave that way, that's what imperils their existence?
Right. Absolutely.
Do you have any techniques whereby when you bring people on board to your startup, where you endeavor to understand their ability to deal with, we've used words change, you brought up the word risk, which of course is very important as well, and the ambiguity, such that first of all, you actually might evaluate whether or not to bring them on board based on that because of the differences that you experience in the startup environment, or might help you understand how to place them well. I would assume some roles are better lent to somebody who can deal with change versus has greater difficulty with change.
Right. Yes. Certainly, I would say hiring somebody into a startup, I think this ability to thrive on change, and I sort of call it one of the leadership principles, which is the ability to look at an opportunity, identify an opportunity, understand how you get there, being able to deal with changed assumptions is an important thing that we look for when we're looking at employees. And one way to sort of one lead indicator of that is to actually, when you're interviewing employees, is to actually understand their past experiences, whether they've been in larger companies or smaller companies, to understand how often something is changed in their environment, whether it's a project, whether it's a product they're working on, have they changed roles, and sort of balancing that with longevity, because you also want employees that are not just constantly flipping from one thing to the other. You want employees that have successfully created an outcome, but during that success, there's been a lot of change that has gone through, but they've been able to deal and overcome all that ambiguity, and they sort of mastered change and essentially manage risk of different kinds. So we do look for that. Again, like I said, not every person is going to have the same level of maturity in terms of dealing with that. So we do look for certain roles where that's important, like people whose job is to say no versus people whose job is to go find the next new thing to do. And also we look for certain roles where people have to balance both, which is also really hard. Good example is product management in a startup is a key part of, establishing the roadmap, looking at competitive landscape, looking at what customers are asking for. And so you're constantly thinking about, new features and new capabilities, but you want to balance that with things like resilience, things like, making sure existing customers are happy, quality is high, and there's lots of reasons not to try and build, for 5 different customers asking for 5 different things. So there is this balance between velocity and focus. And so we, to some extent, what we're trying to do is in a startup, successful startup, you're trying to embed that thinking into every engineer and every person in the company, so that everyone needs to be a mini product manager, thinking about managing his or her work in terms of what's the input, what's the output, what's success, and how do I get there fast, rather than having like a committee or a single person out there who's like, no, you're not going to do these 36 features, right? And so that's the mindset, I would say, that is important in a startup, is to build that kind of an awareness and context in every employee.
Yeah, I loved it that you just referred to committees and the risks of committees. I've heard it said that a camel is a racehorse designed by committee.
That's right. Probably not intended for a desert. Yeah.